Welcome back to the Gentleman's Gazette, and in today's video we'll be turning back the clock once more to the golden age of menswear, the stylish 1930s, and we'll analyze what men actually wore back then. To many classic style enthusiasts, the 1930s are the epitome of style. It's such rarely featured on the Gentleman's Gazette, and many consider it to be the golden age of menswear. Personally, I love flipping through vintage fashion illustrations, particularly from that era, because the wide lapels of the suit and the full cut of the garments are just special. Because of that, we put together an ebook with lots of vintage 1930s men's fashion illustrations, and we talk about how you can use the concepts back then and apply to your outfits today. Unsurprisingly, we call it Gentlemen of the Golden Age, and you can find it in our shop here. I mean, how cool do those guys look? The patterns, the cut, the color combinations, it's unique, yet not over the top. Now, fashion illustrations are one thing. Of course, that was an ideal. Oftentimes, the leg line was super long and the proportions were off to real men. It was just a stylized fashion ad. So the big question is, what did men actually wear? Leading up to this decade, life was getting better for a lot of men, especially Joe Average. World War I was long over, there were new products on the market, working conditions had improved, and class relations had improved as well. The weekend had been invented, and men could spend more time on themselves. Then suddenly the Wall Street crash of 1929 happened, and the world changed overnight, not just in the US, but across the globe. Now, Hollywood stars of that era certainly didn't look like they were going through the Great Depression, but of course, they were part of the top 1% and as such could afford to dress well. But for the average person in the 30s, life looked a lot more dire. Many lost it all, lived in poverty, and it definitely showed in their daily attire. Unlike in the previous 2 decades, and by the way, we have videos like this for the 1910s and 1920s here, men now wore more casual outfits. That meant more sportswear, fewer stiff hats and starched collars. Compared to modern standards, the clothes looked still extremely stylish, but they were less ornate and excessive and had become more practical. New trends were created by the prevalence of movie stars. If they wore something or did not wear something, that trend continued in the general population. Overall, this era is probably where most of our suiting culture today comes from, and because of that, it is very interesting. Of course, many different countries wore different clothing in the 1930s. We focus mainly in the US and Europe. If you watched our other videos, you already know that men back then still wore hats, and that was the case in the 1930s. That being said, young men started maybe skipping the hat, and it wasn't that big of a taboo anymore. What do you think of going hatless, Preston?
Nope.
Amongst working class men, the flat cap was probably the most popular piece of headwear. The flat caps and hats in general also got bigger. You had the pancake-style flat cap, as well as wide-brimmed fedora hats. In England, upper class and middle class gents would still wear bowler hats or Homburg hats, but also fedora hats. In the US, on the other hand, the fedora was the #1 hat with the middle class. The felt was soft, you could add the pinch, you had a wide brim and a big headband and a high crown. Even today, fedoras from 1930s are highly sought after and can fetch good prices in places like eBay. In terms of hairstyle and facial hair, a clean shaven face was still very popular in the 30s. Most men could be seen sporting that baby face look, while older gentlemen often had a mustache. Personally, I like the mustache of David Niven, very delicate, very elegant. Others like Clark Gable or Vincent Price wore that thin pencil mustache as well, very defining of that 1930s era. That being said, a wide variety of facial hair did exist at the time. Of course, with more men going headless, the hairstyles now became more important and changed. Gone were the days of the 1920s where men just brushed back their hair, cut it short, or wore it military style. Men's hair in the 30s was now typically a bit longer, and pomade was used to style it. Even though some men permed or curled their hair in a variety of shapes, the side part was probably the most popular hairstyle of the time. Just look at these men. Some of them would even shave the part, that way it was even more pronounced. Of course, it also meant that this style was the only thing you could wear for a while. Overall, the hair looked shiny and perfectly waxed. none of those hipster styles. In terms of eyewear, the 30s saw a transition to wider and bigger eyeglasses. In previous decades, you had smaller lenses. Now things became bigger and more decorative. The materials had also changed. Yes, you still had the gold-plated and silver wire frames, but you also had celluloid or bakelite frames. Sometimes the bridges were elevated and no longer set on the nose, which meant some of the glasses now had little nose pads to keep on your face properly. Imagine that. Eyeglasses in the 30s were first and foremost used to aid vision, unlike today. The pince-nez and monocles were still around, but mostly worn by actors or older gentlemen, even though they tried to make new styles to appeal to a more younger generation, but that didn't really work out. Of course, if you were part of the aristocracy, chances were you were more conservative and you would still wear your monocle. Interestingly, young women also found an interest in them. Also, sunglasses were increasingly popular, and in the US, you definitely had them if you could afford them. In the US, 30s shirts definitely had an attached soft collar, and that had become the most popular variety. Made sense because men overall went more casual. Of course, for formal white tie or black tie ensembles, you would still wear these starched detachable collar shirts, but for everyday wear, you had the softer ones. Now, sometimes these softer collars were still detachable because it meant you could wash just the collar and not the body or vice versa. While most people today think of detachable collars as white contrasting colors, they would sometimes also sell a number of detachable collars in the same fabric. But today, there's still English legal outfitters who offer these kind of shirts. Starched collars were really something that mostly the elites would wear, or something for special occasions. Overall, the collar points became longer and the spear point collar evolved. Those long spears could be held in place with a collar clip, which was still popular just like in the 1920s. Some collars also had tabs that had the same effect. If you're looking for original 1930s style collar clips and pins, check out our shop here. While looking at these shirts today, it may seem quite elaborate, back then it was a breeze of fresh air that was much more casual and young. Why? Well, previous shirts were a lot stiffer, they usually came in white, and now you had darker tones, such as navy or jewel tone, patterns, interesting stripes, and it just allowed for much more creativity. Probably at no other point in time did you have such a wide but tasteful range of colors and patterns in men's shirting. Open shirt collars for sports also had become more popular. It started in the 20s, but in the 30s you definitely see it more. Made sense because sports like tennis, cricket, or golf had also become more popular. Another big addition to the men's sporting wardrobe came in 1933 when René Lacoste popularized the polo shirt. To learn more about that shirt, how it evolved historically, and whether it's worth your money or not, check out this video here. During the 30s, men still wore ties and bow ties. Ties were much shorter than they are today, they had the diamond shape, and they were typically untipped, meaning there was no lining, unlike in most modern ties today. What does that mean? Well, the blades were simply hemmed, often by machine, or unhemmed. The untipped tie makes sense because it's still elegant, but it's less stiff and it is in line with the casualization of the suit and the outfits of the 1930s. Back then, labor costs were cheap, and by having an untipped tie meant you saved money because you didn't have to pay for the fabric tipping, because fabric was a lot more expensive. Now fast forward to today, things are different. An untipped tie requires hand rolling, for example, and labor is more expensive and fabric has become less expensive. So today, typically the untipped tie is more expensive to produce than the regular tip tie. In our shop, we offer untipped ties as well as self-tip ties from Fort Belvedere in 3 different lengths. So if you want that 30s look, you can get an untipped tie that is a little shorter because that is really essential for that vintage feel. Bow ties of the time also had very thin or no interlining, and so the bow just tied a little differently than most modern bow ties. Now for casual excursions, you could actually see men go out and about without neckwear, which was highly unlikely in previous decades. Now, some men in the 30s didn't want to go without anything, so they wore ascots, and they were somewhat popular. Of course, you guessed it, we also got ascots in our shop, the formal ones as well as the casual ones that were popular in the 30s. Now, in terms of vests and waistcoats, they were no longer mandatory during the 1930s. Central heating was advancing and popping up in more and more office buildings. Double-breasted suits were popular, so you could skip it there, and it was just a new, fresher, less stiff look. However, the men who did still wear waistcoats and vests wanted a slightly different shape. The tips became longer, and you could now see decorative buttons and buttonholes that were never meant to be buttoned, but were just there for the looks. In any case, you always wanted the tips of your waistcoat to cover your waistband, so no tie or shirt would ever poke out. If you look closely at the bottom, some people also call it the shark tooth shape, where you can't button the button. In terms of pockets, vests typically featured 4. A chest pocket on either side and a pocket below that. Even though men still wore pocket watches, the extra buttonhole that was just there for the T-bar of the Albert chain had mostly disappeared by the 1930s. Compared to 1920s waistcoats, the neckline had increased by about an inch. Now, double-breasted waistcoats were also popular during the 30s, and they had a different style. They were cut shorter, which made sense because pants had a high rise. Because remember, they still had to cover the waistband. On top, the V was a lot deeper, and it typically had lapels. Personally, I'm a big fan of double-breasted waistcoats, not just for morning wear in gray, but overall. Why? Well, it had these nice belly lapels, and it's just a detail that you can't really find today anymore. Now let's talk jackets. The lounge suit was still extremely popular with the everyday Joe. The button stance of the 30s jacket was slightly lower, and it was overall slightly shorter in the back. The buttoning point in the 30s was lower than in the 20s and closer to your natural waist. Often that meant that the bottom button of a single-breasted jacket or double-breasted jacket was in line with the top line of the pockets. Of course, only if the pockets weren't angled, which, by the way, wasn't seen very frequently. Pockets were typically pretty straight. The 30s jacket still had a certain amount of waist suppression, but it wasn't as extreme as in the 20s. Also in the 20s, you still had that body coat style. In the 30s, you had more of a drape style, which meant the jacket was cut fuller and there was excess material over your shoulder blade in the back and your chest in the front. To learn more about the English drape suit, head over to our website here. The shoulders were also wider and roomier, and overall, the jacket sat looser on the body. But the fabrics they used were still heavy, so everything draped really nicely. Also, off-the-rack jackets still came in a much broader variety of back variations with belts and shooting pleats compared to today. Personally, I like action backs and shooting pleats and all the 9 yards. These features weren't just purely aesthetic, but also allowed you to move more freely, and it made the suit and the jacket more practical. Yes, while the suit was still popular, the idea of a contrasting sports jacket also picked up steam in the 30s. Now, why did fashions change? Why did we have sport coat combinations and a jacket that was much roomier and bigger when just 10 years earlier, jackets were a lot more tight and tailored to the body? Well, previously, fashions were mostly dictated by the elites or monarchs. Those people didn't have to do hard physical labor, so they didn't have strong muscles, but they were lean and trim, for the most part, unless they ate too much, of course. Now, the 1930s saw a huge shift in this culture. People were more interested in sports, they followed sports more, and so that ideal of the muscular sportsman was much more desirable, and so the suit jacket was built up to make your stature more imposing. At the same time, with a jacket with firmer and broader shoulders, you needed wider lapels to compensate for the overall look. And then you added a pair of more casual pants to the mix. Also, the more relaxed sport jacket called for a more relaxed version of slacks. Of course, men in the 30s also watched movies, and so when Clark Gable skipped the undershirt, and it happened one night in 1934, apparently the undershirt sales plummeted. Overall, the focus of men's fashion had shifted away from the aristocracy and the elites towards Joe Average. While the average person today would look at the 30s suit as being very conservative and formal, back then it was casual, it was soft, and it was new. That meant you had a range of different colors for suits, and also different patterns. Checks, Glenblets, and herringbones were really popular, and colors like brown, navy, charcoal were definitely something that men would wear. But you also had nice earth tones like beige, or cream, or camel as full suits. Today, typically, you only see them as sport coat or pants, not so much as a suit. Normally, suits were made of wool or tweed, but the sharkskin weave also became popular in the 1930s. Single-breasted jackets typically were 2-button or 3-button, and sometimes a 3-roll too. 2-button jackets were typically buttoned on the top one, 3-button jackets on the middle one. To find out everything you ever wanted to know about how to button a jacket, what the rules are, the do's and don'ts, check out this video here. Now the 30s are also famed for their double-breasted jackets, with a wide peak lapels and a 6 buttons. 6x2 double-breasted jackets or 6x1s were popular. That meant you only buttoned 1 or 2 buttons on the jacket. The top row was merely decorative. Also, the overlap of the fabric was quite a bit wider than in the previous decades. I'd say that the 20s were really slim, the 30s were really wide, and most double-breasted jackets today are somewhere in between those decades. The cuff buttons on your sleeves became much more modern in a sense that buttons often touched and you had 3 or 4 buttons with not much spacing in between. While the 30s saw a popularization of double-vented jackets, most jackets still had no vents for a cleaner silhouette. That being said, you could also find center vents. The elites in Hollywood and elsewhere probably had favored the side vents because it was a new thing. Now, if there was only one defining feature for a 1930s men's jacket, it was the wide lapels. For double-breasted ones, they were wide, they were pointed, and the gorge was much lower than what you would typically see today. The gorge was also low for single-breasted jackets, which meant the lapel appeared overall a little shorter, but because it was wider, it was still quite prominent. In terms of pockets, you had jetted pockets for more formal ones, you had flat pockets, but you also had the patch pocket, especially on a casual suit like Clark Gable, and it happened one night. Now, while pleats in trousers were not a thing in the 1910s, by 1930 you could find pants with many pleats, not just 1, but 2 or sometimes more. That meant on average about 10-inch or 25 centimeter pant hem openings, which is quite wide. Because of all that fabric, they were commonly finished with turn-ups or cuffs, as the Americans would say. Oster bags, as introduced in the 1920s, were still around, but they weren't as wide anymore. In Europe, many men would still be wearing suspenders with a fishtail bag and the buttons, but in the US, men really preferred trousers or pants that were cut for wearing with a belt. As such, they had a flat waistband without the fishtail. Now, previously, the buttons for suspenders had been placed on the outside. Now they moved to the inside in case you ever wanted to switch to wearing the pants with a belt. Now, one popular trend of 1930s American slacks was the so-called Hollywood waistband. Now, typically, most trousers have a separate waistband, but in the 30s, that separate waistband disappeared and the fabric just went all the way up. Now, because belts were popular, you had attached belt loops from the outside, and it was a very special look. For example, if you watch old Fred Astaire movies, you will definitely find the Hollywood waistband. Sometimes those belt loops that are attached to the outside are also called drop loops. A little more obscure and definitely less popular invention of the 30s was the Cuban waistband, which had rows of buttons. Now, one thing that really changed in the 1930s in men's trousers was the popularization of the zipper. Previously, men had buttons for their suspenders and buttons on their fly. It didn't matter if they were dress trousers or Levi's jeans. But now the zipper was widely being implemented into men's trousers, especially in the US. Frankly though, this whole social change and how it reflected on pants is best seen if you look at Levi's. Apparently in the late 20s, men started cutting off these cinch belts in the back so they could wear their jeans with a belt. In response to this, in 1933, Levi's offered a service that would cut off that cinch belt when you bought your pair of pants at the store. Remember, back then jeans were still workwear, but most had at least a pair for maybe some yard work or when they went working on the car. By 1937, Levi's stopped producing jeans with buttons on them, but offered them as an aftermarket option. That vanished soon, along with the cinch belt altogether. Overall, the 1930s really brought big changes to men's pants. Also, you had knickerbockers, or +4s, which were quite popular. +4s are technically knickerbockers that hang 4 inches below your knee. Hence the name +4s. Sometimes you can also find +2s, which means they just hang 2 inches below your knee. Others preferred +6s or +8s. You get the gist. So why did they become so popular? Well, it was the Duke of Windsor at the time, probably the most photographed man in the world, who loved wearing them so people saw it, and he was a style icon. Typically, the Duke would wear them during sporting activities, but they could also be worn during just more casual, everyday activities. I think the +4s look particularly dapper as a matching suit. Now enough talk about trousers, let's move on to the shoes. By the 1930s, men's boots had started to wane in terms of fashion, and regular dress shoes were much more popular. Shoes like Oxfords or Darbys, in Captos or Fullbrooks were quite popular, typically in colors of brown, dark tan, black, but also white. This was the time men wore white buck dress shoes. And you can still find them today, and I certainly like them. Also, while not everyone wore them, you could still find a lot more spectator or two-tone shoes than you can find today. Men still wore them in the 1930s, but overall, they rejected excess accessories. Now, what does that mean? For example, there were no more stiff collars. Also, walking canes that were previously used for decorative purposes started to just disappear. Likewise, people stopped wearing spats, and even evening dress clubs disappeared. On the other hand, cigarette lighters, tobacco boxes, and anything related to smoking became more popular. Men also typically had a wallet and sometimes also a comb. Remember, they had these sleek hairstyles and they were still wearing hats, so you really needed one. That's how they came up with these cool little pocket combs that you could just flap open. Men still wore cufflinks, but the button barrel cuff definitely became more popular. In terms of watches, wristwatches were now more popular than the pocket watches of the previous generations. Men did still wear ties and hats and bow ties or ascots, as well as over-the-calf socks, or if they had shorter socks, they had sock suspenders. Stylistically, you would oftentimes see solids, stripes or patterns in the socks, herringbones, or the ones that I really liked from that period, the socks with clocks on the side. To learn more about how you wear socks with clocks, and other socks for that matter, we have an in-depth guide for you, but we'll also sell these typically 30s inspired socks with clocks in our shop here. In today's video, I'm wearing a 30s inspired outfit consisting of an authentic 30s suit. I think it's late 30s, it has a low gorge, wide lapels, kind of a brightish brown color with a herringbone pattern. The buttonholes are all handmade. It's a 3-roll tool jacket, button on a center button, and it has 3 patch pockets, just like Clark Gable in It Happened One Night. You can see the quarters are cut a little more open in the front. The fabric is heavier and it drapes well. There's definitely a stiffer shoulder interlining, and it gives me that broader look in the chest. The pants are of course pleated. They're relatively high-rise, although not as high as maybe some pants from 1910s. They're cut full and straight, which is advantageous for my big thighs. They also feature cuffs that aren't too long and just have a slight break. For my shirt, I chose a light blue, soft cotton brushed twill shirt, and I chose a bow tie in a navy with kind of an ochre yellow, big bold polka dot. The bow tie is not original from the 30s, but it has no interlining and is stylistically kind of a classic butterfly shape, which is what you would have found back then. Men also wore pocket squares back then, so I have this kind of scarab pattern pocket square in blue and green, which picks up the color of the clocks in my brown socks, which are green and white, as well as the color of my cufflinks, which are green and white. The blues go well with my little blue boutonniere, which was a fun accessory that was popular with men. And my fedora hat is not original 30s, but it has the wider brim. It's really soft, and it has an original white 1930s headband. My cufflinks are double-sided and cloisonné enameled, which was something popular during the 1930s. My ring is gold with a tiger side that picks up the brown tones of the suit, and of course it also works with my two-tone brown and off-white spectator shoes. They're modern ones from Allen Edmonds. I don't think you can find them today. The style was called Bel Air. Of course, these are trousers with a belt. They're not a Hollywood waist, but I do have that style as well. For my shoelaces, I went with some from Fort Belvedere, which matched the color of the white leather, and it just ties the entire outfit together. In our shop, we offer over 40 colors of bootlaces, round cotton waxed laces, and flat cotton shoelaces, which are unusual but can look really cool.